and I'd like to introduce Lynn Holt, who will introduce our presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming either to the Oak Room or getting on Zoom. We had quite the storm this morning. I hope everybody's houses are okay. Today we have Dr. Lynn Leverty, and Dr. Leverty retired 2 years ago as a senior lecturer in the U.S. Department of Political Science and was a staff member in the Askew Institute and the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. And I should point out I was one of her colleagues in both those, the Institute and the Center. At UF, she taught courses on women in politics, the politics of immigration and public leadership, and ethics at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Before coming to Florida, Dr. Leverty served as a policy advisor to Governor Ann Richards of Texas, a director of Texas State Agency coordinating state health and human services, and a congressional staff member in Washington. So please welcome Dr. Leverty. Thank you. Lynn, take it away.
Okay. Well, when Lynn asked me to do this, she asked me what group I would like to talk about. And please excuse me today if you hear weird noises. They're fixing my fence, which in the rain, which I did not expect them to do today. So we have some sort of odd noises going on in my house, which I truly did not expect. And since I am a native Texan, I thought, well, I would talk about Latinos because that's a group I've grown up with and been very involved in. And it turned out to be much more interesting than I expected, and I learned a whole lot today. But one of the things that's interesting about Latinos is that they are the only minority group in the country which is an ethnicity and not a race, which means that they are self-identified, and of all the groups, they have two ways to identify themselves in the census. And I thought this was kind of interesting. So when they get the census, they have to fill out number 6, the sixth answer in the sixth part of the census, in which they are asked if they are Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, which seems somewhat redundant, but it's a census. So this is their part of the census where they're asked all of these things. And if they're not Mexican, Puerto Rican, or Cuban, they're asked where other ethnic origin they have, and they're supposed to put that down. Now, for many areas of the country, the other makes no difference at all. For Florida, it makes a great deal of difference. Because of our geography, a great number of people who are of Latin origin, and that is the term now we are using in Florida rather than Hispanic, because a number of people in our state are not Hispanic. Hispanic means that you have Spanish origin, which leaves out Brazil and a few other countries which are not obviously of Spanish origin. So you fill these out, and then you go on to the next one, which asks your race. So you're either white, Black, African American, or Asian, and Asian is all of these, which is interesting. By the way, if you are Arabic, you're white, which I think is very confusing. By the way, Chamorro is the Mariana Islands. I don't quite know why Mariana Islands got their own little point here and not. And this gets to be very confusing for many Hispanics. There's an other down here, and very often they decide to put Hispanic down here. Well, in reality, I got to the point where I actually called a demographer at the Census Bureau, and I said, well, what happens if they put Hispanic down here? And he said, well, we ignore that. Well, and I said, well, where do you put them then? And he said, well, we just ignore that, and we just leave them as white. So what this means in reality is that our numbers on Hispanics is not entirely accurate. And it also means that it's very changeable. And we know this to be true for a number of different reasons. One is that if you are Hispanic, you often, your ethnicity and your self belief often depends on where you are. For instance, if you are a Cuban in Hialeah, you are always going to put down that you are Cuban and that your ethnicity is Hispanic. However, if you are, say, Mexican and you move to a small town in Iowa, very often you lose your ethnic identity and you end up just putting white or some combination other. If you're biracial, you may put black, or you may put some combination of things. I can't tell you how many times I've had students come to me and say that they always put white, their family always put white on the census, but they got to the University of Florida and they found a Hispanic group that they are very involved with, and next time they get to fill out the census, they're going to put that they're Hispanic. And so the ethnicity can change over time for many Hispanic groups, for Hispanic people. So when they get the census, it may change over time. So our Hispanic population changes. Generally, first generation will put down that they are Hispanic. Second generation generally puts down that they're Hispanic. By fourth generation, it really does depend on where you live, who you are associating with, who your family has married into. Some generations, there were generations in the 50s and 60s that tried to get Hispanic people not to speak Spanish, not to be involved in their cultural issues. So if your parents were in that generation, they may not have been teaching you Spanish, they may not follow any cultural traditions, except maybe to have a margarita on Cinco de Mayo, or to maybe follow the Day of the Dead traditions. So this is an identity that is very changeable. So our numbers are not always terribly good. And then when you get this gets right. By the way, one other funny thing the demographer said to me was that we're getting more and more biracial people as people take Ancestry or 23andMe DNA tests. And they find out that Uncle Joe, they find out they have maybe 5% Cherokee or 2% Black. They're putting it in the census. And if you check anything other than white, you're not white. So if you check down here that maybe you have 5% Native American, then you are no longer white. So for the white nationalists in the country, they might not ought to be quite as worried as they seem to be. It may just be that people are checking things from Ancestry or 23andMe. So this is where Latin population is in Florida at the moment, or as a community survey in 2019. I will tell you, by the way, that the 2020 census for our Latinos is really not done well. Not only did they have to deal with the pandemic and with the fact that the census was started late and ended early, but the idea of the adding citizenship question to the census was extremely upsetting to Latino groups. They were very worried about putting that in the census, and although it was not included at the last moment, it did make some Latinos feel like they did not want to participate in the census, and I can talk about that later if anyone is interested. Now, obviously, if we were all in the same group, I wouldn't have shown you this slide, and I would have said, what is the biggest Latino group in Cuba? But I can't do that because we're not all in the same place. So obviously, the biggest Latino group in Florida is Cubans. We all know that they came there, but there are actually two waves of Cuban immigration into Florida. It is not just the group that came after the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and 60. There was a huge wave of Cubans who came into Florida in the late 1800s. They came both to South Florida, but a lot of them came to the Tampa area. So they were already here. And then we had the large group who came after the Cuban Revolution. Interestingly enough, the Cubans who came after the Cuban Revolution did not intend to stay. They came thinking that they were going to be able to go home, that the United States and the people who came at that time were going to be able to overthrow Fidel Castro. So they would be a short-term group who are going to, as part of the Cold War, defeat Fidel Castro and go home. So they had no intention of staying initially. But by 1966, middle 1960s, they were disappointed to learn that the world was really not as interested in Cuba as they hoped the world would be interested. And they realized they were going to be at least long-term residents of the United States. And they had supported new legislation, the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, which gave them a special status, which we have given no other group ever in the United States, which gave them the ability to become permanent residents of the United States after 1 year of residence, which gave them a leg up in becoming citizens in the United States. We have never given any other group that, but after 5 years, they could apply for citizenship. Puerto Ricans, this is a group that always has been in Florida, but it has grown rapidly after Hurricane Maria. They thought many of them, they're long-term residents of Florida. Excuse me, I have allergies. They thought, again, many of them thought that they came of the newer residents, they thought they would be able to go home after Hurricane Maria, and the following hurricane was cleaned up. Unfortunately, Puerto Rico is still a mess. There's long-term issues about the electricity grid. So they are still coming in large numbers. There was a new contract just signed to hopefully improve the electric grid. I don't have high hopes for it. I think we're still going to see large numbers of Puerto Ricans come to the United States and in Florida. And they probably are going to stay with us. And the rest, Mexicans. We have two groups of Mexicans in Florida. And remember, the Mexicans were actually here before the Pilgrims. People seem to think that most of them are new residents in the United States. They were actually here before the Pilgrims. So we have many Mexican professionals, as well as undocumented farm workers. The rest of these groups are here primarily due to unrest in their homeland. And are here both as visa overstayers as well as refugees and asylees. So it's a big population. It is growing rapidly and will probably continue to grow rapidly. And a lot of it has to do, obviously, with our geography. We're one of the easiest places to get to, and it feels like home in terms of being a state with a large Spanish-speaking population. So who can vote? Not a lot of people, but can they vote? You know, if we're talking about who can vote, and Lynn told me that's what I'm supposed to talk about. So who can vote? Anyone who is born in the United States can vote. Doesn't mean they do, but they can because we have birthright citizenship. So if you're born here, you have the potential to vote. Puerto Ricans can vote because they are citizens. There's an interesting issue for Puerto Ricans. They can't vote for president if they're in Puerto Rico, but they can vote for president if they're in the United States. In fact, and that is an issue that has been addressed for a long time. I was just thinking the other day, in my master's degree, the first paper I ever wrote was on the political status of Puerto Ricans. 50 years later, they are still in the same sort of confused place between statehood, independence, and territory that they were when I wrote that paper. So still has not been resolved. Cubans who have taken advantage of the Cuban Adjustment Act and taken the speed lane toward citizenship can vote. Those individuals who have gone through the visa process and the citizenship process Today, that takes about 10 years. It's not supposed to take 10 years, but we are so backed up in our citizenship process that right now it's taking about that long for people who get a visa and can become permanent residents and have gone and then apply for, they take the citizenship test, they take the English proficiency test, and they get the background test. Then it still takes about 10 years to go through all that. But many of the Latino in Florida cannot vote. They're not citizens and they're not eligible for citizenship. That includes our undocumented farm workers. If any of you have been to Immokalee or other places in this, we have a lot of undocumented farm workers, not just undocumented farm workers. If anybody has been in a hotel lately, many of the people who clean your rooms are undocumented. A lot of people in the hospitality industry are undocumented. Some of the residents from Honduras and Venezuela have temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is something we give people who have come to the United States legally on a temporary basis, and then something happens in their home country. For instance, in Venezuela, Maduro, and that whole process where the country fell apart, we can't send them home because they would be in danger if they went home, or we would be endangering them if they went home. So we let them stay in the United States temporarily until it looks like it's safe. Both of these two groups, that will expire in 2022. Sometimes we just extend it. And then people who are on a temporary visa, maybe they come here, for instance, the Epcot workers who march around in uniforms from their country and sing us songs and so forth, they're here on temporary visas, tourists, those kinds of things. And Latinos now, but that Latinos now comprise 17% of Florida voters. So it's still a big number. Now, so who's eligible to vote? If you notice, and I'm going to stop in just a minute because I'd like people to be able to talk, and I can't see hands raised. So Lynn, will you help me with this? In a minute, let me go through this one.
Julianne will take it.
What?
Julianne will help you.
Okay, Julianne will help me. Okay. So who's eligible and how many people actually vote? Well, again, this is people who have actually gone through the process to get to citizenship, and then they actually have to register. And one of the problems we have in the Hispanic community is people do not, if you've got your permanent resident status, they say, well, I can work, I'm legal, nobody can send me back to Cuba or wherever I've come from. Do I really need to go through the hassle of citizenship? Do I have to go through that test? Do I have to go prove I can speak English? Do I have to go do all that? I'm good, I don't really need citizenship. Or do I, I'm fine. So many people don't go through the whole process of citizenship to get there, or they don't register to vote. They are not traditionally sought out by political parties to vote. So there is a real problem of mobilization to register. And there's also an extremely young population who just don't qualify yet to vote. They're under 18, so they're simply not eligible yet to vote. But so what we see in this slide is, even though there's a great gap in eligibility in the number of people who vote versus the number of people who might be eligible, still large numbers. And if you look at this, the significance of this slide, because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, is that in 2008, we had 1.8 million eligible voters. And in 2018, we had 3.1. So the number of eligible people is growing significantly. And that's the only significance I wanted to show you in this slide, is that the numbers are growing rapidly. You really don't expect that anything other than the Cuban and Puerto Rico voters are really going to be able to turn out in huge numbers, because many of these other people are simply not going to have a huge eligibility to vote. Okay, no, we did that. I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, so let me see up here.
Lynn, there were two questions in chat, Lynn. Do you want me to read them to you?
No, I see the chat ones.
Oh.
I'm Puerto Rican and Palestinian. I'm confused every year. Yeah, I absolutely understand. You end up with two kinds of things. And I think it's very confusing. What does Latinx mean? That Latinx,
The shift,
Control.
hold the shift key down.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Latinx is a term that's primarily used by academics to try not to seem sexist. Paul Ortiz, I know you have probably heard from Paul Ortiz and talks to ILR. Paul uses it because Latino is actually male. It's not used by Latinos really mostly at all. In fact, many of them don't know. Pew Research Center sent out a survey to see if they knew what that word meant, and only the young people do. So I'm not using it, but it's Latino actually is male. So I should be saying Latino, Latina, if I was being correct. But Latinx is simply the non-sexist term for Latino, Latina. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions?
I don't see any other hands at this time.
Okay. All right. So where are Latino voters in Florida? Well, 60% live in 3 counties. No surprise, Miami-Dade, Orange, and Broward. 52% of the voters in Miami-Dade are Latino. We'll do it feminine this time, Latina. So there's no wonder that the voting in that county is absolutely affected by Latinas. That is an enormous concentration. That is one of the highest concentrations in the country of Latinos, Latinas. It is one that nationally is looked at anytime anybody talks about voting for Hispanics, Latinas. It's just amazing. And 2/3 of those are Cuban. So it is simply a completely amazing county politically when we look at what is happening in Latino voting. Sadly, in the last election, the Republican Party sent out some of the worst messages in the country to voters in that country, all kinds of things about Biden was a pedophile, the Democrats were going to be socialist, there was a satanic cult in the Democratic Party. If you go back and look at the WhatsApp messages going out, it was just terrible. There was no surprise that the Cuban voters went for Trump in that county, but the social media was just terrible. And there's also the largest concentration of Central and South American voters is also in Miami-Dade, although they are beginning to move north a little bit. 11% of the state's Latino voters live in Orange County, and 2/3 of these are Puerto Ricans. And they account for 14% of the county's voters, and Broward is 11%. This is where some Cuban voters are moving. The congestion and all kind is in Miami is beginning to get to them. They are beginning to move into Broward County. So these are the traditional counties that we look at. If you're a political scientist, you're going to park yourself in these 3 counties when you want to look at the Hispanic vote in Florida. But things are changing, and this is what this year what we're beginning to see is the world is changing in Florida. What we're seeing is the I-4 corridor maybe becoming more of a Hispanic center. These dark counties are the places where Marion County, Lake County, Pasco, Polk are a huge growth center. This is Puerto Rican. This is where many of the Venezuelan, Colombian, Mexican resident people are beginning to center, not in Miami-Dade and Broward. This is going to be where the Democrats are trying to take a stand and focus their attention. This is where the Democrats are hoping, this is where the Democrats are hoping that they can make Florida a swing state in terms of voting. And this is a huge, huge difference for the state in terms of Hispanics. Now you see also some growth in some of the areas up here. This is a statistic anomaly. These are such small, some of these are such, had so few Hispanics to begin with that it's sort of like if you have 2 people and you add two more people, it's a high growth state, but it's just there were very few Hispanics there to begin with, that adding 2 more is not statistically significant. But adding the kind of growth here is very, very significant. So they're going to make a this is going to change the way that we think about Hispanics in Florida. All right, now we're getting something. All right, so now we get into the elections, which is much more fun. All right, so this is traditionally fewer than 40% of Latinos vote in elections. Most of the political mobilization for Hispanics traditionally has been over workers' rights, human rights, farm worker rights, those kinds of things. It has not been on voting. And this is because for many, many, many years, Hispanics, the majority of Hispanics couldn't vote or weren't registered to vote. So it has not been over the issue over voting. This is changing, obviously, as more and more people vote, are eligible to vote. So one of the things that political scientists are really beginning to look at is how motivated are Latino voters to vote. This was a survey that came out like in early October as the election was really heating up, as how motivated are Latino voters to vote. So, and of course, I find this kind of sad because only 69% of US voters were motivated to vote in what was a highly contested election last year. And Latinos came in at 54%. And this is a national election, not Florida. But at least it was over 50%. Now, men 55%, women 54%. One of the things that is this is, as you learned last week from my dear friend Barbara Oberlander, women normally outvote men. This is the one group among women's groups that is not true. Hispanic women traditionally do not vote as often as men do. I think as Lynn mentioned, before I came to Florida, I was director of the Women's Commission for Women in Texas. And one of the things I wanted to do before I left the state was build a data bank of all the women's political organizations in the state. And we found lots and lots of women's organizations that were involved in organizing and mobilizing women politically for all women. And we found a lot of organizations that were involved in mobilizing women and African Americans. And we found a few that were beginning to try to mobilize women among the Asian community, primarily Chinese women in a couple of large cities. And we found absolutely none for Hispanic women. And we went out in the field and asked the question. And the things we found were women who were interested in social justice, and most of those were affiliated with the Catholic Church. And they just said they didn't feel that it would be appropriate for them to be mobilizing otherwise. There's just a tradition among many Latinos that it is just not appropriate for women to be involved overtly politically. This has changed very much in the last 20 years, and there are now groups that are actively trying to mobilize women to vote, and this is working among younger women, but this is the one group that women are still not out voting men. And for anything maybe other than some local elections in some areas of the country. So otherwise it tracks pretty much like other groups. College grads always outvote people with college or less. Unfortunately, we still see young people voting less than older people. And interestingly, battleground states outvote non-battleground because we are all inundated. If you are in a battleground state, you are always inundated with more stuff than you are if you are not a battleground state. So most of this tracked what we see in other groups. So it was not terribly different. What was interesting is the things that they were interested in. Now, again, if I could ask you, if we were sitting in the same room, if I would ask you what you thought Latinos were interested in, when I ask that of groups, people tend to say immigration. Yeah, come down here. Yeah, there's a little bit more interest in immigration, but really, the only Hispanic or Latino groups that are really interested in immigration are those who are affected by it. In other words, they are undocumented, or they have family members that they can't get to the United States because of our weird way that we do family reunification, or they have some personal issue involved. Other than that, many of them are not that interested in immigration. It does not come in as first. It does not come in as in general as their first issue. As you can see here, it's just not their first issue. They are like everybody else in the country. Their first issue is the economy. They want jobs. They want a living wage. They want all the same things that everybody else wants. And this is something that political parties are still not really quite understanding. It's the economy, stupid. Back to what President Clinton used to say, the economy is their issue. Second issue, just like the rest of us, healthcare, access to healthcare. The reason you see a little bit of difference here is that because our healthcare system tends to be tied, access to healthcare tends to be tied to jobs, and many Hispanics do not have the type of job which they get private healthcare. Access is a little bit more difficult for them. That comes in as a little bit more of a problem. Same thing for the coronavirus outbreak. Access to healthcare becomes much more of a problem. Obviously, I mean, this is the issue that surprised everybody. Climate change. That came out of the blue. Absolutely came out of the blue. No one expected to see that climate change would be one of the top issues for the Latinos. And we're still trying to figure that out. There's a second survey that has been done. And what came out of that survey was that most Latinos feel like their local community has been affected by climate change. They talk about, from Miami, they talk about water water levels, which certainly is an issue in Miami. They talk about Tampa, they talk about salinization of the water. They talk about degradation of farmlands and problems with chemicals in the soil. But this we are still studying because it comes across, this is a national study. And this is an issue that we are still studying because it simply was an absolute surprise that the climate change came out to be this important. If it holds, if this continues to be a top issue for Latinos, it's going to change a great deal could have a significant impact on politics in a number of areas because it was simply such a surprise for us in terms of political mobilization of Latinos, how parties react to Latinos, and what happens in terms of future elections. It's coming up in a couple of races in Texas right now. That is true. So, but the rest of this I don't think is particularly terribly different. Foreign policy, again, because many of the Latinos are coming from countries with issues and problems, we think this is that. And again, abortion, not such much an issue. Again, if the Supreme Court acts in the Mississippi and Texas cases, that could be bigger. But so this is, but generally they track, with the exception of climate change, very close to what the general population does, which is not what political parties are, not the way political parties have been addressing this population. Okay, so voter trends. Again, Latinos now comprise 17% of the population. Voter registration has increased significantly in Florida since 2016. So people are registering. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're turning out, but the registration drives, which both parties have been doing, has increased registration significantly. Cubans who were born in Cuba and first-generation Cubans are voting Republican. Younger Cubans are less conservative. They may vote Republican, but many have no party affiliation or vote Democratic. They may not tell Grandpa. Puerto Ricans lean Democratic, but they're not homogenous. And this is something that the Democrats need to be aware of. And they are treating the Puerto Ricans like they are Democratic. And this is a real, this is a real mistake. They're moderates, but they do not, 1/3 are registering as independents. And the party is not, they're being treated as they are Democrats and do not really need to be taken, and that is a real problem. Foreign-born Latinos are more concerned about immigration issues, obviously because they have families they have been left behind. And if they are staying in the United States, it is often very difficult for them to get their families here. Our family reunification policy is a real problem for them. And this, for them, this is an issue that they are worried about. Young Latinos tend to be more liberal, but they're less loyal. And the national gender gap does exist, but women aren't voting as often. So we still have that. Now this is amazing. Oh, nah, I keep sorry. All right. 31% more Latinos voted in 2020 than they did in 2016. This is enormous. This is the biggest jump in any group in recent history. We don't know why, because they were not really contacted by the political parties. Fewer than 40% of Latinos were contacted by any political party during this campaign. Now, I don't know about you, but my mailbox was full, my phone was full, my email was full, my everything was full of being contacted by political parties. And fewer than, in some cases, in some groups, 20% of them actually was contacted by any political party. So this was a significant jump with very little mobilization by the political parties. So and only in urban areas were they contacted by community organizations. So much of this is self-mobilization, not by any kind of organized group. Latinos did support the Democratic candidate. And even the Cubans only did support President Trump, but only by 52 to 45. So I have a feeling those youngsters were in here did not support President Trump. As one of my former students said, they were both old, boring old white guys, but I guess I like the one of the boring old white guys better than I did the other. Miami-Dade did support Trump 2-1, but the Latinos in the rest of the state preferred Biden by 2-1. So the majority of Latinos in Florida did vote for Biden. You couldn't have told that by the news, but they did. 30% of the new voters were young. Participation in that age group grew 41%. So even though that survey that told us that young people weren't excited, young people did turn out, and a lot of the mobilization was aimed at that age group. Now in Arizona, we know that the Latino electorate did flip the state for Biden. It was that group that did flip the state for Biden. I'm not sure what they're going to think about cinema in a couple of years. Interesting will be to see. And Latino groups are claiming, and I'll get to them here right now, that they did help in Georgia and Wisconsin, given the margins in those states were so small. A question. On the slide summarizing Latino votes, when you say among this group, am I referring to young Latinos disaffiliated with the political party vote Democratic, or the group is Latinos overall? Let me go back. Okay.
What I was asking for is the last two bullet points. I think what you mean is women in general who are identified as Latin support the Democratic Party more than men. But the previous one is young Latinos. So I thought maybe you referred to that as the group in which women vote more Democratic.
Yeah, no, yes. I mean, you mean Latino women support the Democratic Party more than men?
It was young Latino women I was interested in.
Oh, young Latino women, yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, they do. Okay, current issues. Neither political party understands the diversity of Latino vote, and neither is successful at reaching out to these voters. As I said before, the National Election Survey found that when they parsed out each of the groups in terms of both national origin, age, party affiliation, none of the groups ended up reaching 50% of Latino groups by either age, party affiliation, national origin. They simply are not reaching the Latino voters. And it goes as low as 20%. They're not reaching them in terms of issues. They're just not reaching out to Latino voters, which is extremely is odd as this group is growing. And you think in Florida it's 17% of our potential voters. Not reaching them is just very sad. They receive fewer contacts from political parties than other voters. For instance, the best they can do is Puerto Rican voters. 44% of them were contacted by Democrats, and 35% of them were contacted by Republicans, but neither party reached half of any Latino group. So the best was in Florida was 44% of them heard from some kind of Democratic outreach, and 35% by Republicans. So the parties are not doing well at reaching out to these groups, and they're also not understanding that really they're in the economy and healthcare are their two big issues. So they tend to reach out to them on things like immigration. The Puerto Ricans don't care anything about immigration, they're fine. So it's a very odd sort of problem with both parties. They're, especially for the Democrats, who seem to think that except for the Cubans, they don't have any problem with Latinos are just going to turn out for them. But indeed, what we're finding out is that they are going, many of them are simply going to registering as independents. And nationally, they are now registering more as Republicans. Well, it's almost, excuse that typo there. They're actually, it's almost comparable for Republicans and Democrats, but a little bit more for Republicans right now, depending on where you are. But there's a real question about whether the 2020 vote was pro-Biden or anti-Trump. Because excuse me just a second. I'm getting a lot of fence noise behind me. They're repairing my fence, and there's a little bit of noise behind me. The Democratic Party needs to be worried, in other words, because there is not there's no data that we can, that we can see that tells us that the Democratic Party should be just sitting there and saying that they should count this as a win. So, and there is an increasing gender gap in the Latino community. President Trump actually increased his support by men by 4% in Florida. We're not sure why. There's all sorts of ideas, but part of it we think may be his strong push about law and order.
Lynn, I do have a raised hand. Do you have time for a question?
Yeah.
Sarah Toussaint, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Lynn. This is a lot of this is validating to my personal experience as a Latina voter in Florida, so it's nice to see it in writing. One of your previous slides just had some voter turnout data, and I thought maybe I'd share some things specific to Alachua County if you're interested. we're here. And Carmen Diana, she's also on. So I'm president of the Democratic Hispanic Caucus for Alachua County, a new position. Still learning what I'm doing, but within Alachua County, we've got about 10,500 registered Latino voters, of which 7,000. Well, let me break it down here. The great news is whether you're Republican or Democrat, the turnout was about 74%. So we did see a pretty high voting.
That's great.
Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise. And then within the breakdown in terms of registered voters, Hispanic voters or Latino voters, 7,100 are Democrats, 2,800 are Republicans, and then we do see about 5,000 are not affiliated. And so that's something that, we as a group are trying to figure out a little bit more. So I just thought I'd share that with everybody here.
Yeah, no, the unaffiliated is, and that is a trend in general right now among voters, is that a lot of people are registering unaffiliated because it's sort of a pox on both their houses. We don't like either one of them at the moment. And given what's going on at the moment nationally, it makes some sense that people are feeling that way. But that's a great turnout. It's not the turnout we've seen in lots of other places. And I think we will, I think as we unpack what happened, because we're still unpacking what happened last November, we're going to know more about whether or not the 2020 vote was pro-Biden or anti-Trump in all areas of the country. We're still trying to unpack that. And what exactly happened with why Latino men are more in Florida, why he increased his support among Latino men. I do think some of it's law and order. I think defund the police is probably one of the stupidest things that anyone has come up with. And that does not read well among the Latino community and lots of other communities as well. So I think that is part of the problem. I think obviously there's some good organizations that are targeting women too that will help. But let me see, I know there's some things in the chat room. I don't know if Nikki and Val Deming, what they are they whether they're overlooking Latinos and Latinas or not. Let's hope not. I think anybody anyone who is campaigning in Florida, if you ignore the Latino vote, is crazy at this point. You're just absolutely going to miss a huge part of the population and an increasingly important part of the population. And one that is going to be increasingly, we know that 1 million new voters, Latina and Latino voters, are going to come on as potential voters each year because it's a young population and they're going to reach the age of 18 each year. And so this is a group that's only going to keep growing. And so I think, especially, I know on campus, there's a number of groups that I used to be affiliated with who were working very hard on voter registration and voter education, and they're going to be very active. And so anyone who is not taking that into account and not making sure that they are running and trying to attract these voters is going to be missing a great deal. But I think it is really, the parties are not doing a good job, I think, at this point.
Lynn, I do have a question here in our Oak Room, if you have a moment.
Okay, all righty.
Thank you, Lynn, for your excellent presentation. I just had a question. Is anyone tracking how this population of Latinos, in what manner they vote? Do they vote by mail? Do they go stand in line at their local voting place?
I don't know that. I have not seen anybody track that.
I wonder if
I-
they tend to vote by mail at all.
I do know that there is a tradition of having very long lines in Miami-Dade. So I think it really does depend on location. But I don't know the answer to that.
Because the lack of access may influence also how they vote. You know, it's just
Yeah.
too much trouble or something.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very good point. And I think in some areas, one of the things obviously that is going to be key is that if these new voter laws make it so much more difficult to vote, that is obviously going to be a problem.
So since you also know a great deal about Texas, do you know the percentage of Latino voters in Texas?
No, I don't.
Okay, just
Um,
thought I'd ask.
um,
Okay,
I
thank
do
you.
have one other, I just added this for fun. Well, it wasn't necessarily for fun, it was sort of interest, which is what's happening in Congress. This young man is now an interesting thing. I was trying to figure out how they counted diversity in Congress, because that's also an issue. And this is a young man who was elected in New York. And he is gay, Black, and Hispanic. And I was trying to figure out how and he ends up, when they count diversity, he is now, but they don't count, there's only 2 gay members of the House, so obviously they don't count that. But he is counted as both Black and Hispanic, and I was trying to figure out. So he increases both categories here. But the number, this is the diversity in the House of Representatives at this point. And so there are now 50 Black members, 46 Hispanic members, except he's in both of these, 17 Asian members and 6 Native Americans. And I was just sort of interested in the increase in diversity. And of course, this is out of 435 members. So certainly there has continued to be an increase, but that's still not very many.
John Reiskin, do you want to ask your question? Unmute.
A little question about the list of Hispanics by origin in the state. I saw no listing for Brazil. Is Brazil, I always thought, I seem to run into Brazilians everywhere. So I'm just wondering, do we have many Brazilian Floridians?
Not enough. The number of Brazilians was rising, but it hadn't, but that was stopped with the pandemic. It hasn't reached a critical mass yet in terms of numbers. It was obviously increasing. I found that out when I was surprised by that when I went to Orlando one time, and instead of asking, they kept having signs about saying that they follow Portuguese, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
But it has not reached a large number. And obviously when the pandemic came, and the absolute disaster of Bolsonaro's policies on the pandemic, the numbers stopped. I think we will see many more.
What are, you know, also in this country, we have the NAACP and we have several other groups that represent a wide range. For instance, there's a good Muslim organization whose name escapes me. I'm wondering, I've heard of RAISA. I'm wondering if there are any organizations that are kind of representative of all Latinos. As you introduced at the beginning, this is not a cohesive group, you know. And so when we see Latinos, we're making a generalization that may be even weaker than expressing other generalizations of other minority or even majority groups in this country. But I'm wondering if there are any leading organizations that seem to represent the Latino.
Well, I mean, there's LULAC and La Raza, and Sarah can probably help me here as well.
Yep, Unidos is a civil rights and advocacy group, so maybe closest to NAACP. But yeah, there's a good number. That's a good question.
Good.
But, again, Cubans kind of stayed with themselves. And again, traditionally, these groups were much more human rights groups than they were voting groups.
Right. Yeah.
Because, again, they were much more politically into human rights and workers' rights groups than they were voting rights groups,
Right.
because
Especially,
Latino, yeah. And
especially,
again, I think this is changing, obviously, because many more people can vote now.
I hope so.
And I think if we ever got, there's been an attempt year after year after year. I mean, the last major immigration reform bill was in 1965. And traditionally, every 20 years, we had an immigration reform bill. And it's stalled since really, we've done piecemeal bills since 1965 that changed little bits of things, but generally that was the process. We thought every 25 years we need to change it. There have been bills introduced in Congress to basically support clearing up the undocumented, allowing undocumented people who have been here for a long time, who have worked, who have not committed crimes, to have a path to citizenship, and they have been turned down repeatedly. There was one in the 1990s. There was actually one, I can't remember the year now, the Gang of Eight, which Marco Rubio was a part of, that would allow people to have a path to citizenship to clear up that backlog of people who've been here. It kept being turned down. So we are actually, which would have, which is, in my opinion, now that I don't have to be bipartisan all the time in the classroom, I can say is absolutely ridiculous that we have not passed these things.
Yeah. What proportion of DACA young people are Hispanic or are Latino?
Virtually all of them.
Yeah, that's
Virtually
interesting.
all of them.
So that becomes probably a major issue unrelated to quote unquote immigration in an odd sort of way.
Yeah. And again, I think, the president is trying to get that through, trying to regularize the status of those people. This is the only time I've seen that we have actually penalized people for what their parents have done. But immigration has become, traditionally, of course, it's always been controversial, but it has just become, and we are not increasing. And it's interesting, you have an odd coalition in Congress of immigration rights groups and corporations together trying to increase visas and trying to regularize the status of a group of people against a weird coalition of anti-immigration people. And immigration is actually my sort of area, and it's so strange to have these groups, and then you've got this odd sort of group, anti-immigration, because we just don't like it, immigration groups, and we can't seem to get anywhere with it. And it's sort of odd. And the corporations are absolutely adamant that they need more workers' visas, and they'd like to regularize the process, the status of people. And they need more agricultural visas, they need more workers' visas, and they just get nowhere. And that would very much change the whole politics of all of this voting. And so forth.
Mm.
And how we got on that, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you.
Lynn, do you have more on your presentation, your PowerPoint?
Nope.
Are there any other questions?
I don't-
Lynn Holt, do you have any questions or comments?
Well, I had one question. I think that a pretty large proportion of Latinos would be Catholic relative to the general population. And even though abortion may not be their first or even second or third priority, it could conceivably be a motivating factor when it comes to mobilizing voters to either Republicans or Democrats. So I was wondering what you thought about that, Lynn. It's just something that came to mind when you were talking.
Well, I can say that there are different again, not all Catholics obviously believe everything that the Vatican tells them about. And certainly I think birth control is one of those issues that that certainly is not followed across the board. I think there is very little support, for instance, for the Texas law, where you're putting neighbors against neighbors and that kind of thing. I think there's very mixed support I think like virtually most people, there is mixed feelings about abortion among Latinos that I have. It's not an either or. I think it's just as mixed as the rest of the population.
Well, it's just something I was thinking about while you were talking. I don't have any data to support things one way.
I think for most people, I think it's not the issue that's going to mobilize voters as much as other issues. Now, if it came down to, I think right now it's not going to be the issue that's going to mobilize voters. Again, I think it's going to be the economy and healthcare, and it would not ever be the Texas law. I think that's just,
Yeah.
I think that not that. I think there's concern. I think there are mixed feelings about it, and it's just not going to be the issue I think that's going to mobilize. Now, again, depending on how the court came down on the Mississippi case, that could mobilize a significant portion, perhaps.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to watch that.
Yeah. I think law and order is another issue. I think that, again, many Hispanics are members of law enforcement. And I think that's an issue that potentially may turn if the Democrats don't find another way to talk about police other than defund the police. Could be a major way to turn toward the Republican Party. I think you're seeing that in a couple of Texas races, local races right now. I think that could be one that the Republicans could certainly use. So I think it just really depends.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
Mary Grusin, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if you think COVID statistics, especially COVID deaths, will affect the statistics the Hispanic, or no, let's say the Latino statistics we've been looking at.
Yeah, I think that when you if we look at those numbers in next year, I think the ability to access healthcare and the number of COVID deaths are a real concern.
Yeah. And that won't show up till major counting goes on again, right?
Yeah, well, I think there has been so much disinformation that has gone out, and some of it has, especially in rural areas, I think there's a lot of fear. And I think that social media has been a real problem.
And you're talking about vaccinations there as well as deaths and.
Yeah, I think vaccinations and death, and I think in some areas, there is a real
Impact.
there that I think is going to be, that we don't know yet.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, we'll know eventually.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate your presentation. I don't see any other questions on my side.
Okay, then thank you, Lynn. That was very informative.
you.
I learned a lot. And next week we'll hear from Susan McManus, and she will be talking about a generational look at Florida's electorate. And that's the topic for next week. So hope you can join us next week. Thank you again, Lynn, for doing this, and everybody have a good day. And I hope it gets a little drier the rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.